Is it safe to protest in a pandemic? Are the government being honest with us about the scale and causes of deaths from coronavirus of people in ethnic minorities? And which Tory MP has already sided with Trump against racial justice protesters? I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial for the next hour to get to the bottom of all of these questions. How's it going, Dalia?
It's going good. I mean, time is meaningless. So who knows? I feel like my whole brain is turned to mulch just because I can't find a way to break up between the days. But other than that, I'm doing all right.
Well,
I know today is Wednesday.
You can now put Wednesday's Tisky Sour to give you a sense of the week existing.
How I conceptualize time now.
For the first part of the show, we're going to be joined by author of Necessary Trouble, a friend of the show, Sarah Jaffe. How's it going, Sarah?
Hi, I am not currently under curfew, so I guess that's a good thing.
Oh, not under curfew at all? Can you do whatever you want?
I can leave the house now because it's 3:00. For Sunday night and Monday night, it was 6 p.m. in Philadelphia. And then last night it was 8:30, but we're only getting notified about it about like 10 minutes before it goes into effect, which is real helpful. Yeah, it's great.
Could get tear gassed at any point.
Could get tear gassed at any point walking my elderly dog down the street. Yeah.
With Sarah, we're going to be talking about the big stories coming out of the United States, obviously. First, share the show link. Tweet your comments on the hashtag TiskySour. We'll be going to those throughout the show. So, in response to the spread of protests against the murder of George Floyd, on Monday evening, Donald Trump gave a speech in the White House Rose Garden. Let's take a look at the key part.
That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Okay, so that was on Monday night. It's now Wednesday. Sarah, you're in Philadelphia. You don't yet have army generals walking down the street. I mean, can you explain the sort of significance of this? What does it mean for Donald Trump to say that he could order the military out onto the streets of the United States? Although, as I understand it, they already are in DC. It's about whether he sends them to the rest of the country that's the issue at play.
So it's complicated, right? Because the National Guard is already here. The National Guard is state by state sort of called in by the governors. And so we have the National Guard out. Minnesota has the National Guard out. A friend of mine was just posting pictures of Humvees rolling through the streets of Chicago. So the National Guard is technically part of the military. It's the part of the military designed to do things like this, as well as to show up in hurricanes and other major disasters. So that's already here. The Washington, D.C. is a weird case because Washington, D.C. is not a state and it's not a city. It's a sort of occupied territory of the national government. And so they've already got military. They had like a military helicopter, ironically, with the Red Cross on it, buzzing crowds the other night. And so on one level, and also we should just talk about the amount of insane military equipment that like your average police department has now. But on the other hand, it's been interesting that since Trump said that, we've seen like the defense secretary come out and say, no, I don't support invoking the Insurrection Act, which is the thing that would allow them to send the actual military in, even as they are sort of mobilizing active duty troops to be outside of Washington, D.C. So it's kind of a mess. I don't think we're going to see active duty military in the streets of any of these cities so far. But this is a moment where these Democratic governors and Democratic big city mayors have to actually figure out where they stand.
I think we can bring up some footage of troops, US troops guarding the Lincoln Memorial. So that's in Washington, D.C., as you said, so under direct control of the federal government. It's pretty sinister. There was, although I suppose that's the force that America projects around the rest of the world. So it's not as if people haven't been subject to people looking exactly like that on their national monuments before. I want to ask a question about something else that Donald Trump mentioned in that clip, which was, are we going to come? We can come back. Why would the Second Amendment, right? So Donald Trump said we need to restore law and order to ensure your right to the Second Amendment. And for any of our audience that aren't aware, the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Yeah. Now, from where I'm standing, none of the protests that were happening, I mean, they were threatening property. There were police threatening many people's lives, but I didn't really see anyone threatening people's right to bear arms. What the hell was he talking about, or what was the message he was trying to get across?
I mean, on some level, Trump's speeches are just like a grab bag of words meant to inflame his supporters and make sure they stay happy with him. So, the Second Amendment is just to literally like tell white people who have guns that Trump is on their side still. On the other hand, like Philly has actually been one of the worst places for this, where we actually see like sort of white citizens brigades 2.0 in the streets. They beat up a reporter for the local public radio station the other day in Fishtown, which is a sort of historically white working class neighborhood that's been gentrified in the last several years. And there, I saw a picture this morning of some dudes with rifles, like literally on top of the GameStop, because apparently that is the important institution of white culture that they must protect at all costs from the protesters. There were people setting up like outside of the Target to protect the Target from protesters the other day. So there is like an intent to use those Second Amendment rights by, white people in parts of America right now. And we saw this in Ferguson too, where the Oath Keepers, which are one of many sort of far-right militaristic groups that come out of, decades of far-right organizing, they mobilized themselves to go to Ferguson to try to protect property during the protests. There's a bit in my book where I actually talked to one of those guys who, in doing that, decided to side with the protesters and broke with the Oath Keepers. But so, the Second Amendment is always sort of this weird live issue that's floating below the surface of a lot of American politics. And it's related to, I think, that thing we talked about the last time I was on here, which is that frontier mentality of, being able to exercise your rights however you want to and defend yourself against anybody who might possibly infringe upon them, even if that just means like walking down the street while black.
Now, I want to talk about one of your real areas of expertise. You're like one of America's top labor journalists. You write a lot about trade union struggles. And on Monday, we talked about one profession being sort of presented in Manichaean terms, so good cops, bad cops. Now, what we're seeing is a similar portrayal of trade unions. We've got good trade unions, bad trade unions. Let's take a look at the good side. So on the good side, in both New York and Minneapolis, the police have attempted to commandeer public buses to transport police and arrestees. But in solidarity, bus drivers have refused. So this is a Brooklyn bus driver refusing to drive arrestees in his bus. So that guy drives a public transit bus. The police say, stop doing your public transit bus. We want you to transport police and arrestees. He says no. And he was backed up by the local trade union. As we can get up a tweet from the New York Transport Workers Union. TWU local 100 bus operators do not work for the NYPD. We transport the working families of NYC. All TWU operators should refuse to transport arrested protesters. So showing both, unions at their best, showing solidarity and then protecting their members against, well, presumably that driver would have been at risk of being victimized by his employer. We're going to go now to the bad side, though. And the bad side is the police unions. You might not be surprised to hear that. We're going to have a listen to Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey give his explanation as to why violent cops have been able to keep their jobs and stay on duty in the city which he runs.
The elephant in the room with regard to making the changes necessary to combat the institutionalized racism and have a full-on culture shift is the police union, the contract associated with that union, and then the arbitration that ultimately is necessary. It sets up a system where we have difficulty both disciplining and terminating officers who have done wrong. And so if you want to see a full-on culture shift, there's a couple things. It's get new officers in that embody the vision of our very forward-thinking and very procedurally justice-oriented Chief Arredondo, and get officers out who do not embody that vision. We do not have the ability to get rid of many of these officers that we know have done wrong in the past due to issues with both the contract and the arbitration associated with the union.
So that was the democratically elected mayor of the city where George Floyd was killed, basically saying, and the controversy was that the policeman that killed George Floyd has received 17 complaints, has been involved in 3 shootings already. You know, they should have known that this was a wrong one. So the question is being posed to this leader: you're in charge. Why was he still a police officer? And he's saying, look, it's not my problem. I couldn't do much about it. Neither could the police chief, in fact, who he's saying is a pretty progressive person. The problem is the police unions, who are stopping political appointees, clearing out the racists and the violent thugs from the police. And I want to know from you: is this just blame shifting? How much truth is there in what Jacob Frey is saying there, or is this all a political maneuver to try and wash his hands of what's happened under his watch?
Yeah, I think that the tendency to blame the problems with police on their unions is usually pretty wrongheaded. The police unions don't really behave like most other unions. I was reading a tweet thread from a labor lawyer the other day who had written a paper while in law school on the differences between police unions and how they exercise power. And he basically said that he had compared the Chicago union, which has a very big and involved and convoluted contract, with the NYPD, which has a pretty straightforward one because public employees' rights in New York City are pretty limited. And both of those are incredibly powerful police forces that, Andrew Cuomo was just apologizing to the NYPD he apologized to them on a private phone call after having publicly criticized them. So I don't think that the way that police exercise political power is through their unions, political donations, things like that. They enforce their power through the sort of implied threat of chaos. So they say, we'll stop doing our job and your city will be in chaos. They say, they actually literally threatened Bill de Blasio's daughter the other day, who got arrested at one of the protests. And the Sergeants Benevolent Association, I think is the name of the particular police union, that literally doxed Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York's daughter, while she was in police custody. So, they exercise their power sort of by making threats. And I really wish political people like Jacob Frey or other officials who say they want to rein in police power, I would like them to be a little bit more honest about what they're afraid of. So Steve Fletcher is a local elected official in Minneapolis. He is a former organizer with community groups. He's got ties to unions and things in the neighborhood. And he had a tweet thread the other day where he was literally talking about just having made some comments about cutting the police budget, which had not actually been done and they did not successfully do. And suddenly he was getting calls from constituents that they were having a hard time getting the police to come out when they needed them in his district. And they were telling residents, call your councilman and ask him why we won't come. So the police sort of operate like the mob in a way, rather than a traditional trade union. And so I think that we have to to talk about police unions, understand that and the particular ways that they wield power, which is not so much at the collective bargaining table, despite what the mayor there would like you to think.
Dalia, you're also actually a trade union expert, aren't you? That's what your PhD is on. Are there any workers that you think we shouldn't allow to organize?
Well, I think as sort of Sarah outlined, you know, this does not operate in the way that other unions sort of operate. But I also think, and this kind of connects to your question of, is it right to kind of blame the police unions and slash, you know, what are there workers that we shouldn't allow to organize? I think the question is much more, what is actually like the function of the police, right? So the problem with the US police, you know, in particular, is not that they have strong unions. It's that it lies with the fact that policing emerged from slave patrols as a way of defending property rights and landowners. So it's always been to manage the movements of particularly the racialized working class, to ensure that slaves were kept working, were kept disciplined, to prevent slave mutinies. And, you know, so when we say property rights, we're including in that the holding of slaves as property. That distinction between black and white people, those who could be enslaved, those who could never be enslaved, was maintained by the police. So this is not an issue that begins with unions. It's an issue that begins with the institution of policing. And it's the same in the UK. You know, we see the emergence of policing happen through and alongside the creation of urban working classes under the Industrial Revolution. And again, in the UK, it's a way of managing and disciplining the working classes and to suppress and crush revolt. So these are the contexts in which modern policing was developed. It basically allows the state to declare a myriad of like behaviors and people and communities as criminal. And then once something becomes criminal, you can use any amount of violence that you need to in order to stop it or to curb it. So I don't think that this is really a question, you know, the police union are not doing this through the framework of workers' rights. Really, the question here is, what is the function of the police? And therefore, that is how we should relate to them. So that it's difficult to envision a way of policing existing in a way that is not to enforce those particular class boundaries through violence.
A brilliant explanation of the function of police. What I'm going to say though, is, no offense, but there's a video which is 2 minutes long, barely any words, and I think it explains the function of the police, especially in the United States, better than anyone could in an hour-long lecture. A phenomenal piece of footage, which was shown live on Fox on Monday. It shows not just the racism, but also the incompetence of US cops. Let's take a look.
This vehicle and those guys over there got out of the other vehicle. There's a gold store in the parking lot, and they were heading to it. And these guys came out and they said, "No, you're not."
Wow.
And he's with us. They're having a standoff here.
Oh my God.
Arguing about why they're not being allowed to break into the place. Here comes the cops. They're trying to flag them down. We're trying to flag down the cops. Oh, hold on. Let me flag them back here. They're driving past us. Oh. Stop.
This is one of the most surreal moments we've seen. What is underway right now in Van Nuys. All right, so here come the police officers to help these community members.
The guys on the other side are in cars. All right, here they come. The guys here are trying to stop over there from looting in the cars. All right, now they're telling them, no, they're fine.
They're good.
Oh, gosh. Oh, gosh.
No. Whoa.
Oh, my God. Joe, to your right. Come on.
He's with us.
He is with me. Press. Sir, they're okay, sir. They're the store owners. They were protecting the looters, sir.
Whoa.
They're protecting the stores. The looters are over there.
Stand down for a sec, please. Yeah, relax.
You're losing your looters. They're going down that way. These are the people in the store trying to stop.
Point. All three of them.
Okay, we're putting those in handcuffs right now.
No, they're not the looters.
One person talk. Where's the looter? Where's the looter?
They're helping protecting this building.
Okay, where'd the looter go?
They were.
Okay, description. Black, white, Asian.
African Americans. They're
to show you how easily and quickly things can go wrong or can be misinterpreted.
Wow.
Christina.
This is one of the wildest things I've ever seen. And then to see
now they're taking the woman from the car. She's not involved. She just stopped to look.
Okay.
I think she is with these people. And she came over to get her mom because she saw it on TV.
I mean, they are so fucking dumb, right? The bit where the journalist, is trying to explain to the police officer, no, they're the people who are protecting the shop from being looted, and the cops just sort of like, oh, don't worry, we got them. She's like, you can't understand, you're not listening to what I'm saying. I mean, I'm assuming that you all followed what was going on there. I'll just lay it out in case anyone was a bit confused by that 2 minutes of chaos. So the people, I think it was their shop, they were trying to defend their shop against looters. They were trying to wave down the cops who were driving along by and getting ignored by them fundamentally. Ultimately, the cops do come along to, well, what the shop owners hope is to, scare away the looters or whatever. What they do is they see black people in front of the shop who were the owners of the shop who were calling them down and assume they must be the looters because they're black people in front of the shop, start arresting them. The journalist is saying they're not, that's not the problem. I mean, and then it ends with them arresting the shop owner's daughter who's just driven past because she's seen the whole thing on TV. I mean, Fox is saying just to say that's what it seemed to me, because I can't get that's what it looked like to me, but I don't think there was much ambiguity there. And you also have to think that if those journalists hadn't been there, then all of them, the owners of the shop, her daughter, they could all quite easily have ended up in jail, right?
Or dead because they like to shoot people, and that's the thing, is that's what happens, right? Like, this is what happened in many of these police killings that people are protesting, is they burst into people's houses, on a drug raid or something else like that, and they literally shoot whoever is there who vaguely looks like they might have been the suspect, which basically just means they're also black, and that that kills hundreds of people a year, it just being the wrong person. And right now, with them super amped up, with them having all of these weapons out now, people are getting shot with rubber bullets, with tear gas. It's just a recipe for, that scene is kind of funny, right? We can laugh at that a little bit, but like, that woman could have just gotten shot right on camera and we would all be watching that instead. And it's, it's terrifying. And we can joke about like, they can't even protect property well, but like that's a bunch of people who are pointing guns at that woman. And if one of them felt threatened for just a second, he could have just pulled the trigger.
Mm. And he would have got off probably. Dalia.
Sorry. Oh yeah. And it's that combination of total impunity and obviously the racism that underpins the distribution of property in the US. And the fact, but I also think that this kind of I don't want to say indiscriminate, because obviously it is very discriminatory, but this kind of sense that if you exist in particular communities, if you exist in particular bodies, you are kind of always at the risk of that kind of, as you said, the police bursting into your home and being able to do whatever it is that they want to do to you or can do to you and being acquitted. And that comes back to this question of when, like, how the institution of policing, once it is able to designate particular communities as suspicious or as pre-criminal, is a term that is actually used in the UK policing system. Literally someone who might not be a quote unquote criminal now, but will be a criminal eventually. And once you have been unfortunate enough to fall on the wrong side of that, the state is able to use any means of violence against you. And that is consistently the defense that is used in order to let cops off the hook. They say they felt under threat. Their job is so hard. And that's how they appeal, I think, a lot of middle class Americans is, wouldn't you be so scared if you had to spend so much time in these communities and with these people? Of course they feel threatened by a man sleeping in his car, etc., etc. So again, there is that question of, yes, this looks like a kind of comical or indeed indiscriminate situation, but actually that kind of unpredictability and constant precarity is part of the disciplining function of policing.
Right. Right. When we talk about Breonna Taylor, who was one of the other people killed recently that the protests have been, lifting up, she was killed in her house by police who were serving a warrant. And she was not the person who was a subject of the warrant. She was, I just looked this up to actually make sure I got this right. They had like heard some rumor that one of the people they were trying to find was selling drugs and had used her address for a delivery at some point. And for that, she was killed in her own home. And so that sort of tension, that sort of fear. The interesting thing about these sort of citywide curfews is they are weirdly generalizing that fear in a way that a lot of people who look more like me have never really experienced. Like suddenly, I live in West Philly, which is a historically Black neighborhood. I'm closer to the university. And so it's a little bit more upscale where I am, but it's not a really clear line. It's sort of, and so the people in my neighborhood are now being policed the way they would be if they looked differently and lived 3 blocks the other way. And that kind of experience is sort of like the experience that a lot of young people had in the student movement in the UK and in the Occupy movement in the US. So where you have sort of white, middle-class raised people experiencing violent policing for the first time, it really changes how you look at the world, I think, right?
I think that's going to be my final question for you, actually, Sarah, which is, are the police really playing with fire here? The fact that, their behavior, one, is getting filmed and spread widely on social media.
Yeah.
The other, that they're imposing these curfews, which are indiscriminate. And normally the effect of police violence is concentrated on Black people. So they think, well, they're not in our voting group anyway. And then also they're doing completely weird things, like just shooting at journalists. Like, could we be approaching a bit of a perfect storm where after decades of a complete inability to reform, the police have no choice but to shift to some degree how they do their jobs?
The one other thing that I would add to that is that we're about to have a ton of state budget fights because the coronavirus economic crisis, right? And the states can't run a deficit like the federal government can. So the states are going to have to look for places they can cut. And suddenly the people who have already been organizing on the ground for a long time demanding cuts to the police budget, suddenly those people are walking in saying, hi, have you seen what they were doing? Because I watched it on the nightly news. Suddenly you've got, again, your average middle-class white person is suddenly sharing on Instagram the place where you can call in and demand that the, New York City cut the NYPD's $6 billion budget. And that's going to be a really, really interesting set of political fights right now. And this brings back to the union question also, I think, because teachers' unions, among others, have started making these demands already. I think I sent to you before, Michael, that the Minneapolis Police Department, Minneapolis schools ending their contract with the police department to get the police out of Minneapolis public schools. Peter Fraze, who is also a friend of Navarra's, I think, went to public school in Minneapolis and posted about going on a protest against those cops in schools in high school. And they're finally going to be out of the schools. So when we think about the amount of time people have been making demands about cutting funding, getting policing out of these communities, getting policing out of the schools, we're seeing things move already. And I think we're going to see a lot more pressure and a lot more struggle around this in the months, year or so to come.
That's a good reminder that probably in my good union, bad union summary, I should have made it more clear that there are more good unions than...
You can always love on the transit workers, though. The transit workers are kind of great.
When logistical workers go on strike, it's just so beautiful to watch.
Yeah, there was an incredible, I'll post it on Twitter after this, an incredible statement from the Transit Workers Union in DC about all this too.
All right, Sarah, Jaffe, we're going to have to let you go for us to go on to the important question of protesting in COVID-19, which is going to be relevant to you as well, it seems. Sarah, always a pleasure. We'll speak soon. Super interesting. It's so that video. I mean, I know it's obviously, stupid and banal for people to say, "Oh, it's not like it is in America, in the United Kingdom." But I haven't actually seen a video like that before in my life.
I mean, I think it's also, part. I mean, with the UK police, they they often have to resort to doing these kinds of things behind closed doors. So when we see, the suffocating of George Floyd, that is almost exactly, when you read the reports of what happened to Jimmy Mubenga, to Joy Gardner, it's almost exactly the same. But I do think there is something about the militarization of the US police. And we have to remember that a lot of techniques that are used in policing domestically are developed abroad. So we see weaponry, we see, machinery that is developed in, through the military industrial complex to use in Afghanistan, to use in Iraq, etc., brought back onto the homeland. So I think it's really important as we talk about this to make that connection as well, that, violence always starts with those who are most at the periphery, and it always inches closer and closer and closer until now it's, affecting white middle class people who want to protest against the power of the police. So that's why you should always, that's why solidarity is so important, because it stops the violence before it gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
We're going to go to some comments. Petro Lisa says, "Oh my God, cops react on less knowledge than an empty pillow." Agree with you there. Edward Leons says, "Bumped into an American black man working in a well-known computer retail store a few years ago. He said, 'You can't reason with American police.'" I mean, from that video, from so many videos we've seen over the past few days, that's also hard to argue with. The murder of George Floyd and the resultant protests across the US have sparked demonstrations worldwide. One today in London drew thousands of people, really big. But in the middle of a pandemic, is protesting safe? To answer that question, we're joined by Timesh Pillay, an NHS doctor and specialist in lung infections and immunity. Mesh, thank you for joining us this evening.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for give us the medical advice that we need. Well,
it's not the easiest of questions that is the billing for today, but we could maybe have a few discussions about this.
I don't like to give you morally simple questions. Let's go straight in there. Do you think people should be going to protests whilst COVID-19 is still widespread in the community?
So look, from a health care and health perspective, as many other healthcare professionals will be able to testify, it's very clear that coronavirus is a huge public health threat, but so is racism, and that can manifest in many ways. We've seen the video you just showed of the fear and stress that must be a daily occurrence for many Black people in the US and indeed here in the UK, but also on a structural level, poverty, the type of employment, overcrowding, other health problems that come with being Black in the UK cause health problems. And so I think it would be silly for me to focus on one and not the other in my response to that. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. In terms of practical, I was going to say in terms of sort of like practical advice, you're a specialist in lung infections. I presume that includes how not to get them or pass them on. I mean, what do you think that people who choose to go on protests during this pandemic should consider, or even the people organizing them? How would a protest be organized differently so that the risks of spreading coronavirus can be reduced as much as possible?
For sure. I don't think I could sit here and propose that a good answer, given the risk, is mass gathering as a general rule of thumb. However, and we don't know this for sure, being outside seems to be of lower risk than being inside in terms of transmission. And we probably catch the virus by touch and indirect droplets before contaminating your own mouth than aerosol, i.e. just breathing in somebody else's exhaled air. So if protests do go ahead, there are probably 3 steps that you'd want to consider. There's the before, during, and after. And I think if you took that approach, you could really try and minimize risk. And bearing in mind that though the youngest cohort of our adult society and even adolescents will be most likely to protest, the younger you are, the more likely you are to live with someone who's higher risk. So a parent or a grandparent. And I think it's really important to remember that your risk doesn't equate to the risk to society, and you're a direct part of that chain of transmission. So bearing that in mind, I suppose before getting to a demonstration, a protest, some kind of political action is best done in open air. And so that can refer to, walking, cycling, by wheelchair, by scooter, rather than public transport. Obviously, cars not that logistical given a mass gathering. Once you get somewhere, you have to consider not only breathing in someone else's air, but also who you touch, what you touch, and how you might then touch your face. And actually, washing your hands, trying to stay distant because you might be hit by someone's droplet as they're speaking if you're close, but you're less likely to if you're further away. And wearing a mask are probably still the most important health messages. Now, a mask is slightly controversial, but there's growing scientific evidence that masks are a logical and evidence-based solution, mainly to protect others from you. And bear in mind, as a young person, especially, you might be infected without knowing it. But also to protect yourself, because if you touch your face, you're less likely to contaminate your mucous membranes. So that's during. And then afterwards, I mean, when I get home after a shift in the hospital during coronavirus, I actually put all of my contaminated clothes straight in the washing machine, not dishwasher, and then go and have a shower straight away. I live with my parents. So bear in mind that you might be carrying the virus on you, even if you're not infected.
Really
Does
useful.
that make sense?
That's really useful. I want to bring you in, Dalia, for the next question. So there's an added complication with the Black Lives Matter protest, because it is the communities who are protesting who've been hit hardest by coronavirus. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail later. But I noticed that, there hasn't been complete consensus about whether these protests should be going ahead. So I saw a statement from BLM UK. So they were the group who organised that wave of protests a few years ago, and they weren't opposing having a protest, but they distanced themselves from the people who were calling for it. And they said, "We are currently discussing the implications of calling a mass march in the middle of a pandemic that is killing us most." So I wanted to know what your position here, Dalia, in terms of sort of navigating that kind of, moral and strategic dilemma between the obvious need for a protest and for people to get out there and show their disdain at what's going on in the United States and why it's not completely alien to the racism that's happening here, but also the fear that this could be putting at risk precisely those people who have already been hit hardest.
Yeah, I have to say I've been very conflicted throughout. I think protesting and taking to the streets is something that always carries risk. It always carries bodily risk. It carries all other kinds of risks. So that's not really as distinct. But I think, there are those of us who go to protest and choose to take those risks and kind of take those measures. But what worries me here is that we may be putting at risk our most vulnerable, the most vulnerable people in our communities. And I think all revolutionary or protesting action should always take, the care and the protection of the most vulnerable and the people who are most likely to be neglected by the state, especially within a pandemic, that protection and care to those people should always be at the center. But I think that it really does say something, as you've kind of already mentioned. It says something that people are willing to take to the streets, even with this pandemic, because for many Black and brown people, for people with uncertain or irregular migration status, the risk of pandemic, even though it is disproportionately affecting us, does not feel as high compared to the risk of existing in a world where the next Grenfell or the next George Floyd or the next Jimmy Mubenga or the next Belly Mujinga. We've just had a situation where someone who spat on a Black transport worker has been acquitted, when we know that that's not been the case for people who have done similar things, especially to, I think the last story I saw was a white police officer. Someone spat on him, saying, now you have coronavirus, and he has been held accountable for that. So with those kinds of racialized violence seeming around the corner all the time, it feels to many Black and brown people, I think that the opportunity to take power in that moment feels like a risk worth taking despite the pandemic. So I think it shows that strength of feeling and the fact that this question of risk is not just a reality for people of color in the middle of a pandemic, but there's that kind of slow violence of state neglect. But I do think that, this pandemic is going to be around for a long time, and we can't stop organizing, whenever there's a pandemic on, because it's going to be with us for a long time. So we need to find, I think, ways in which we can shut stuff down, in which we can organize that keep our most vulnerable safe, because, I think that should always be at the heart of our movement. So I cannot completely understand why people are taking to the streets. I think it is in many ways powerful, but I think we are going to need to come up with new pandemic-friendly strategies to kind of organize and make and put power and, exercise our own power, whether that's through strikes, whether that's through other ways of shutting the system down. And, structural, change is not just done on the streets. Obviously, it's very important, but there are many other ways of getting involved. And I think that especially when we look at these huge insurrectionary moments, we need those kind of long-term preservation, that long-term work in order to ensure that we're not just immediately crushed. So there is a lot of work to be done. And I think that it's not just about the protests, but I think the fact that the protests are happening despite all of these issues and despite the existence of a pandemic shows the strength of feeling. But I would really implore and hope that organizers are doing everything they can to make sure that people can follow the advice that has just been outlined. And I think I would also say that, if you are living with a vulnerable person, or if you have to go into work where you are in contact with vulnerable people, there are other ways to get involved in the kind of, this is a long ass fight. It's long-term change. There are many ways to get involved. You don't have to feel like you have to put vulnerable people that might be around you at risk.
So I feel like we're having a very good faith conversation about the dilemma between wanting to show your objections to what's going on in the world and trying to keep people safe. I want to go to a couple of tweets from people who haven't necessarily been such good friends of the Black Lives Matter movement historically. So we might take their interventions in a slightly different way. Let's go to Kevin Hollinrake. So he's a Tory MP. He shared an image of Saturday's protest at Trafalgar Square with the caption, can we get this up? Hope these people don't blame the government if there's a second spike. Now we're going to go to Julia Hartley Brewer, talk radio host, who today shared an image of that Hyde Park protest with the caption. Can we get this up? Thousands of people are at a Black Lives Matter march in Hyde Park during a pandemic, breaking lockdown and social distancing rules to protect a horrible crime that happened in another country. And the UK police are doing absolutely nothing to stop them. That's lockdown over then. I want to get your thoughts on those two sentiments. I'll go to you, Mesh.
Well, that's something you've got to add into your calculations with the way the UK media is, and your attempt to get a message across to the public. I suppose we don't know if outdoor gatherings are high risk, but we have to assume they are. I'd say in a month or so we will know, and we don't know how much weather affects the ability for the virus to survive outside. So some are actually estimating that we'll only see a second wave in September as people move indoors due to the weather, etc. So we can't know for sure, but I think it's a risk, and politically I can see how it's a risk as well. If the true blame, which lies clearly with the government, isn't somehow has a counter narrative.
Dalia.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, because I think if we allowed the way that the media are going to spin things to guide our actions, we wouldn't do anything. So, but we people absolutely will blame the government if there is a second spike, because how can you put people in a situation where you are making people have to go on public transport, which getting on the tube at rush hour when wearing masks is not mandatory, when social distancing is not possible, when the provision of resources that has been done in other countries, like antibacterial dispensers being everywhere, free masks being dispensed, clear public health messaging on, you know, the necessity of wearing a mask when you're outside the house, etc. That is seems to me. I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I will defer, but that seems to me to be a much more systemic and much bigger risk of a second spike than a protest where people are doing everything they can to social distance. And from what I've seen, everyone is at least wearing masks. So they will try and spin it in that way, and we have to be very careful of that. But even with my sort of hesitations around some of the around public, street protests, as I outlined earlier, we can still be absolutely steadfast that the completely calamitous messaging, the completely irresponsible behavior of the government when it comes to the measures taken in order to open schools, in order to open bars, in order to open restaurants, is far more is placing far more systemic risk that could then cause a spike than these protests.
I think you're both almost being too fair to Kevin Hollinrake.
No, it's obviously, but people are taking much more precautions, and the organizers are taking a much higher duty of care to these protesters than the government is for the people. So obviously it's complete bullshit, and they are going to talk in these ways because they will find any possible way that they can discredit Black people protesting. So really it's part and parcel of this kind of resistance. It's not really new.
Let's get up some footage actually of people in Hyde Park, because I think it is really worth emphasizing that we have a government who have fundamentally told people that meeting outside is basically safe. That's why they've allowed beaches to become incredibly full up. Across England. That's why you see parks which are quite busy. I'm not really complaining about it because, I mean, I know that Mesh is saying we should be careful outside, but the message from the government has been that this is a disease which is mainly transferred inside. And whilst the government have been clear that this disease is mainly transferred inside, they haven't taken really any precautions to allow people, even who are in the most vulnerable categories, so people who have serious lung conditions or who have suppressed immune systems, are people who they said are clinically vulnerable and so should stay in their home if they're not to basically get killed by coronavirus. They haven't provided any measures to let that happen. So we know that there are 1 in 10 people who are in the clinically shielded section. This was according to the Citizens Advice Bureau, who are still going out to work. And that's because the government haven't guaranteed anyone the right to be furloughed if they're in that clinically vulnerable group. They can ask it, but if their employer doesn't want to give it, they won't give it. And we have probably more than the people who were there in Hyde Park in an open space on a windy day. So I agree 100% with Mesh about the precautions that need to be taken, and with Dalia. But the idea that this is more dangerous than that many people getting on the tube at rush hour, and some of them clinically vulnerable because they haven't been given any financial means by which to not go into work, I just think it's so stupid and outrageous that this guy Kevin Hollinrake is trying to blame a second spike on that protest in Trafalgar Square. Because, I mean, even if a few cases of coronavirus come from that, and that's a serious issue, we shouldn't downplay that. If they really cared about avoiding a second peak, what would they do? They would allow people to stay at home, even if their boss is demanding them to come into work when their only way is to get there is via public transport. So anything these people say should be rejected outright. Julia Hartley-Brewer was also someone who was, I was on her show in the run-up to this. She was very skeptical about going into a lockdown, but now it's people on a Black Lives Matter protest. Suddenly she cares about the lockdown. Ridiculous. I think we're going to go on to our next story, Mesh. So we're going to let you go. But any final thoughts, actually?
No. Thanks a lot. That was informative for me as well.
Well, I think it was very informative for our audience. I'm not sure if I'll decide to go on these protests, but I think that advice was excellent.
I think the one thing I would say is we need to hold ourselves to a standard that is, not only a bit higher than government messaging or government action, but a lot higher. And we can't let trust in government, which is at an all-time low, affect our own assessment of our own health and the health of our loved ones at home.
Yeah, that's an important point. Timesh, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have your medical expertise on Tysky Sour.
Cheers, Michael.
We are actually, before we go on to our next section, we're just going to show a clip from that protest. If you want to see detailed coverage of the Black Lives Matter protest, which happened today in London, listen to tomorrow's Burner with Ash Sarkar. But now we just can't resist showing you this clip of the actor John Boyega at the demonstration today.
Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. We have always meant something. We have always succeeded, regardless. And now is the time. I ain't waiting.
So, I mean, clips of John Boyega were, social media was flooded with them today. Incredibly powerful stuff, right?
Yeah, massively. And I think it's that, when you look at that clip, and I think this is really what pisses a lot of white supremacists off, because when I remember this clip, I think it was of Ash on Jeremy Vine maybe yesterday, when that woman was trying to kind of say, of course Black Lives Matter, but these protests are not legitimate. And then she was like, well, you also said that Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was also not legitimate. And she was like, well, he was meant to be performing, or he was meant to be playing sports. That was no time for a protest. And I think there's this ongoing thing in particularly amongst like Black Americans, where there's this expectation that like Black people are there to entertain, to perform for us, and to not have a political voice. So I think seeing, musicians like Stormzy, seeing actors like Boyega, like doing this is just like really, really great, because I know that kind of pisses people off so much because they are so widely loved. So yeah, it's incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's like, I didn't pay $5.99 to watch the latest Star Wars movie on Amazon Prime just so John Boyega can go and stand up and protest about white cops killing Black people.
Yeah, but the gag is
the attitude. We've got some breaking news. Court documents have just confirmed that charges on Derek Chauvin have been upgraded to second-degree murder, and the 3 other cops have been arrested and charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. So, I mean, obviously, still a long way to go. Most cops, get off at the final hurdle, but this does seem like political pressure is having an effect. We're also going to go to one comment. Zara said, Fiverr can always count on Navarro to have the vital conversations we need and cover the important angles that legacy media are not. Black Lives Matter. Thank you so much for that sentiment and for that super chat, Zara. We have known for weeks that COVID-19 is taking the lives of people from ethnic minorities at a disproportionately high rate. This week, a government report into the unequal outcomes of coronavirus was due to be released by the government, but there were some complications. So initially, it seemed the report would be withheld. Let's take a look at Sky journalist Inzamam Rashid breaking that story late on Monday.
For us, he's actually in Downing Street for us. Good evening to you, Inzi. So what's caused the delay this time?
Well, Sarah, we know for weeks that Black, Asian and minority ethnic people have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And ever since those first findings came out, this community really has been worrying. A report was then commissioned by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and led by Public Health England, which was set to be released at the end of May on Friday. Public Health England said that that was delayed because the report hadn't been finalised. Now, I was then told that it was penciled in for this Wednesday, but tonight, Whitehall sources have suggested to me that the review won't be published this Wednesday because of what they say current global events and increased protests in London. One source at number 10 said that they are incredibly worried that this could be in too close proximity to the Black Lives Matters protests, and it would be a bad taste if they published it.
So the idea that the government weren't going to publish facts about the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on Black and ethnic minority people in this country obviously caused a great deal of controversy and outrage, both on social media, but both also from the opposition. So Labour called for the document to be published in full. Then kind of confusingly on Tuesday, so contrary to what that Sky journalist was briefed, the document was published with sort of little warning to it seems many people who were sort of had an interest in that document. And the report revealed things that are not much of a surprise but are pretty damning, which was that people of Bangladeshi ethnicity have twice the risk of death from COVID-19 than people of white British ethnicity, that's controlling for age and sex, and people of Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, other Asian, Caribbean, and other black ethnicity have between a 10% and 50% higher risk of death when compared to white people. Now, if when I tell you that you're outraged, you should be, but you might also feel like this is a bit deja vu. We knew this, we knew these facts already, and you're not the only one. So there have been big criticisms of this report as a complete wasted opportunity. So, for example, the chair of the British Medical Association was highly critical of the report, telling The Guardian, it is a statistical analysis which, while important, gets us no closer towards taking action that avoids harm to BAME communities. The BMA and the wider community were hoping for a clear action plan to tackle the issues, not a reiteration of what we already know. So he also criticised, so that was Dr. Chand Nagpal, who is the BMA Council Chair, so that's the Doctors' Trade Union, or the doctor's professional body. He also criticised the failure to address the particular danger to frontline BAME workers, so e.g. that 90% of doctors who have died from COVID are BAME, or to address issues such as exposure to the virus. So that's the idea. It's still unconfirmed that people who are in close proximity to people with coronavirus for a longer period of time are more likely to die from it. This, to me, seems still like an open question in the scientific community, but not mentioned in the report. There have since, though, been suggestions that the government censored parts of the report which did point to structural racism as a cause of unequal health outcomes. This is from the Health Service Journal today. So it says, an earlier draft of the review, which was circulated within government last week, contained a section which included responses from the 1,000+ organisations and individuals who supplied evidence to the review. Many of these suggested that discrimination and poorer life chances were playing a part in the increased risk of COVID-19 to those with BAME backgrounds. HSJ understands this section was an annex to the report, but could also stand alone. One source with knowledge of the review said the section did not survive contact with Matt Hancock's office over the weekend. So it seems that one possible and plausible sequence of events from what we know here is that the government were planning to put off publishing this document because they didn't want to do it whilst people were very focused on the fact that parts of the state are racist, and so decided to put it off. Then there was a backlash. They decided, oh no, we will publish it, but they didn't publish some of the more controversial elements, or some of the elements which would have rightly angered people. That seems like a plausible sequence of events. Dalia, I want to get your thoughts on both the circumstances that have sort of surrounded the release of this report and what it contains.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely farcical, but also completely unsurprising, and also like a kind of perfect representation of co-option, with the fact that Hancock was tweeting Black Lives Matter while the report that he commissioned was being suppressed because they didn't want us to know that the British state is structurally racist, and that's why we have this disparity of deaths amongst BAME people. And I mean, I'm extremely disappointed, especially that the report did not go into the issue of work. I think that is, and kind of tried to really stick with a lot of these biological explanations, but was very fleeting on questions of structural racism. It makes me worry that when we look at these, when we over focus on different kinds of biological explanations, that it encourages us to basically relinquish responsibility for the loss of Black and brown lives, because it kind of says, well, they're kind of they're kind of biologically destined to die more, so we don't really need to take any steps. We know that work is absolutely a central part of this. The IFS have found that a third of all working age Black Africans are employed in key worker roles. That's 50% more than the share of the white British population. And, that Pakistani, Indian and Black African men are also respectively 90%, 150% and 310% more likely to work in healthcare than white British men. So the fact that that kind of relationship was really not investigated and focused in the inquiry, I think is a way of relinquishing responsibility for the conditions that people are working in, particularly Black and brown people. And again, the fact that we haven't seen any concrete commitments or steps moving forward in terms of what are we going to do about this, the underlying conclusion seems to be, well, BAME people are dying a lot, and that's just going to have to stay that way because we're not doing anything about it. And we are seeing in policy as well, we are seeing that the policy that's coming out is continuing to ignore how working class people who we know are disproportionately Black and minority ethnic people or people who can't work from home, that policy is continuing to ignore the reality of their lives. So a perfect example is schools opening and the fact that for, this idea that people can get their kids to school without using public transport, that is very much going to disproportionately affect Black and brown working class people who live in cities, who don't have cars and who rely on public transport. So, and again, people who are going to have to go into work because they can't work from home. So people in the hospitality industry, people who work in bars and restaurants, etc. These are all, again, the people who are going to be disproportionately affected by that policy. So we've had this report commissioned, this report released, albeit in a delayed way. And, the situation somewhat partially outlined, but all of the very issues that have led to this crisis are literally continuing to be allowed to go on, and decisions are being actively made that are going to continue this disparity in who gets to live and who is left to die during this pandemic.
I mean, I think also what this shows, and this connects to everything you've just said, is the danger of opposition, and not just the Labour Party, but in general, the media do it as well, to be allowed to be palmed off by the government by them saying, "Oh, we'll do a report on it. We'll do a report on it." Because there were concrete steps which could have been taken 2 months ago, right, to try and stop this unequal consequence of coronavirus existing, and that would be by keeping. Well, it wouldn't just have benefited BAME people, it would have benefited everyone by putting in place policies which meant that people who were vulnerable to COVID-19 would have the right, the ability to, the financial ability to stay in their homes and keep themselves safe if that's what they needed to do. It would also mean giving people who work in frontline jobs PPE at the time. Yes, a report is useful, but a real repetitive thing that we are seeing over this whole crisis is there being really obvious solutions to a really, really tragic, huge, enormous problem. And the government says, well, the Labour Party often says, actually, we need clarity on this. We need to get to the bottom of this. The government says, fine, we'll do a report. Then a report comes out a month later, which doesn't really tell us anything new. In the meantime, loads of people have been going to their frontline jobs without sufficient PPE. Many people in vulnerable situations who should be made to be able to shelter themselves, shield themselves in a financially sustainable way, they still haven't been given the financial resources they need. So you've got people who are going out there risking their lives while we're waiting for a report. When the report comes out, it doesn't tell us anything new whatsoever. It's why we should be making concrete demands of the government, not allowing them to palm off these issues for a report, because the solutions are often right before your eyes. And the reason they're not happening isn't because they're mysterious and we need some social scientist or biologist to look into them. It's because there isn't the political will. The government think it's too costly. And quite frankly, they don't care about the people who they think it's going to harm.
Yeah, and it's particularly egregious when this is it's not like this is a situation that happened and is closed and now there is an inquiry. Nearly 400 people died today. Like, time is literally of the essence. This idea of wasting time and staving off responsibility through a report is frankly just another step in the state's the state's apparent mandate to completely neglect particular parts of the population in service of this idea of the economy needing to recover. It's absolutely egregious.
We're going to go to our final story now. Before we do so, please give us a like. It helps in the algorithm. And most important, if you are a new viewer or a regular viewer who hasn't yet subscribed, press the subscribe button. We want to get up to 100,000 by the end of the summer. At Tuesday's press briefing, when Matt Hancock commented on the COVID report and on events in the United States, he said Black Lives Matter. But not everyone in his party has got the message. Let's introduce one, Desmond Swayne. In fact, Sir Desmond Swayne. They knight some very odd and awful people in this country. This is him in Parliament. I think we've got a few images of Desmond Swayne. There he is, great tie. I can't remember what, it's got a sort of napkin in his pocket. Sort of a great British oddball. They often turn out to be wrong ones. This is him sleeping behind Ken Clarke. Now, we're talking about him today because a constituent of Sir Desmond Swayne emailed him this week to ask, in her words, so he's her MP, she asked him to, condemn Trump's actions, support Black Lives Matter, Black people in our community, and urge the UK government to take action. His response to this very reasonable request shouldn't have been too difficult to give a respectful answer to that. But what was his reply? Thanks, sorry to disagree. Arsonists and looters have it coming. So that's a question about all of these images we're seeing from the United States. As we showed in that clip earlier, police are arresting people, beating people up who aren't arsonists and looters, right? So it's a nonsensical reply, and it's also incredibly offensive. Now, if you recognize Desmond Swayne, if you've seen any controversies he's been involved in the past, even though that reply is outrageous and awful, you might not find it surprising. Let's take a look at a scandal that Desmond Swayne MP got involved in last year, and it involves, surprise, surprise, blackface. So in response to the unearthing of photos of Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, in blackface, for which Trudeau apologized, it was a pretty embarrassing situation for him, pretty awful. We talked about it on the show at the time, but Desmond, his intervention was not to, castigate Trudeau for what he'd done, but to say he shouldn't have apologized. So let's go to this quote from Desmond Swayne's blog at the time. So he says, it comes to something when you can't dress up as Aladdin without attracting the opprobrium of the great and good. He would have done better to have said it was an entirely acceptable bit of fun and refused to apologize. I once went to a Blues Brothers themed fancy dress party as James Brown. I went to some trouble to be as authentic as possible, wink, wink. I can assure readers of this column I have no intention of apologizing. I suppose I should clarify that I added the wink wink. That wasn't in the original blog, in case someone's going to try and do me for defamation or something. A photo later emerged of that party. We can take a look of that. Oof.
Oh my God.
In response to that picture, Swayne said the lady in the photo was definitely his wife, but he couldn't confirm whether or not the man in blackface was indeed him. Finally, as to whether he would do it again, he told the Echo newspaper, let's get this up. The reason I wouldn't do it again is because you have to go to some trouble to get it off. Dalia, I'm going to go straight to you. How the fuck did we come to a position where these are the people representing us?
I mean, I guess these were always the people representing us. And I mean, I thought Trudeau's blackface was the most aggressive blackface I'd ever seen. And then I saw that, and now I don't know, I feel like the last vestige of my innocence has been taken away. But this idea, this is a really key way in which racism works. And we see it with the hostile environment. We see it particularly in this country. We see it particularly through the lens of migration. It just designates who deserves to live and who is left to die. And we really mustn't buy into this idea. We see, and this idea of looters and arsonists have what is coming to them. Within that, he has basically designated everyone who is protesting into that category of looter and arsonist. And once you've been put into that category of looter and arsonist, that allows a blank check for violence against you. There is no level of violence too harsh. Similarly, with when we talk about raids happening on undocumented workers in this country, there's a sense of they committed a criminal offense, even if that so-called criminal offense was escaping or fleeing a context in which they are not safe, is categorized as a crime. Therefore, it doesn't matter what happens to them. But we also know that these terms like looter, terrorist, criminal, undocumented migrant, these are all very ideological terms. Not everyone who loots is called a looter. Only particular people can get that name, and that's where we go back again to what the function of policing is. The function of policing is not to prevent so-called looting or to prevent harm. If it did, everyone who gambled on, people's mortgages and led to the 2008 financial crisis would be in jail right now. It has a very specific function of how culture and the law and all of these other different strategies and policy force people into particular categories, and therefore that gives a blank check for the police to do whatever it is that they want to them. And even people who might consider themselves to be sort of somewhat liberal or somewhat progressive will buy into that. So we see it a lot in the Labour Party, particularly the kind of blue Labour wing, which is this idea of we can win people over on the basis of law and order, because it's seen as somewhat palatable that if someone does something that is seen to be a crime, we can do whatever we want to them, and we don't unpack how what is considered a crime is often very ideologically bounded. And again, I saw a tweet the other day that I think really helps to clarify this, which is when you look at a lot of media headlines, when violence is done by the state, it's described in very passive terms. So someone dies in a situation that involves a police. Someone, is hurt and there's a situation and, the police are involved. I think Amy Klobuchar called it police-involved death or something like that. Whereas when there is violence happening from someone who does not have power, it's described in active terms. And so it becomes much easier to justify anything to happen to them. So, he says it in very, very crass terms, but it is kind of the basis upon which a lot of violence that happens to marginalized people happens. It's this idea that they have it coming to them. And I would particularly emphasize, and when I talk about, I particularly emphasize migration, we create these endless different categories of migrants. And upon that, through racialized ways, and through that, we decide who has violence coming to them and who doesn't have violence coming to them. Even in the most stark examples in the Grenfell Tower, we had examples of people saying, well, a lot of them were undocumented, so they shouldn't have even been in the tower to begin with. The then logical conclusion being they had the fact that it was burning down coming to them. So this logic is something that very much underpins a lot of discourse. And this guy has just said it in a really aggressive and horrible way. So yeah, thanks for introducing him into my life, Michael.
Well, we've got more from him, actually.
Blissful innocence.
And although I think you're absolutely right to focus on probably the most significant thing there is what he said about looters and arsonists, sort of saying that they have what's coming to them. But I think our audience probably wouldn't be surprised that he doesn't get disciplined for that, because whilst it's an appalling and very dangerous worldview, it's quite it's still socially acceptable fundamentally. The blackface thing, though, you might have thought he'd be at least a slap on the wrist, but no. After pictures came out of him in blackface, and he celebrated basically wearing blackface and said the only reason he wouldn't do it again is because it takes a while to rub off, and it presumably does for him, because we saw how much effort he took there. The Tories went out and defended him. They said they defended his light-hearted response to being found out as someone who uses blackface. Completely appalling. And we're going to end the show with one more piece of evidence you need, in case you weren't already. To be honest, if you're not already persuaded that Desmond Swayne is a wrong 'un, that's a bit worrying about you. But I'm sure most of our audience already are convinced. But I just want to hammer it home. So, in a separate blog post, this was on the growth of food bank use in Britain. You can expect he's going to have a nice, sensitive response to that. Swayne was forced to apologise this time. He didn't apologise over blackface, but on this one he did. Let's get up the quote from his blog. To put it bluntly, and in terms that elicited shouts at protest at the hustings, that's his words, the poorest are among the fattest. The conclusion I draw is that their families need, in addition to welfare payments, help with how to shop more cost-effectively and healthily. Again, that was Sir Desmond Swayne, MP. Unbelievable.
Just saying the quiet part out loud, basically.
Yeah. He is like a Victorian caricature. Gross. He's like sort of like I feel like Jacob Rees-Mogg has sort of learned that you can't say stuff this bad anymore, but Desmond Swayne is like, I'm still like I feel like he takes pride in being one of the most appalling racist, classist douchebags in Britain. But the upsetting thing is not that he feels capable of doing it, but he's still allowed to be in the governing party, sitting on benches, falling asleep. Like, he's not even competent, this guy.
Yeah, complete impunity. But I also think like the way that he responded speaks to a particular constituency that, you know, find this very thrilling. You know, this idea, people who find, you know, political correctness to be like a form of oppression, and he's like throwing off the shackles of, you know, the real oppression in today's society. You know, that's not the first time that we've heard sort of so-called political correctness being talked of in those terms.
We'll go to a comment. YetiFace14 gives us 20 euros. Thank you very much. A big thank you from a fellow Michael. Keep up the great work, comrades. I'd say more, but my heart can't take it right now. Our thoughts with you, Michael, and thank you for your very kind comment. Thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight. If you do want to support us directly, well, if you already are, thank you so much. You make this show possible. If you want to become a donor, a subscriber, please go to devaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. We'll be back on Friday at 8 p.m. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Dalia, Gebrial, it has been an absolute pleasure as always.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah, good night, everyone. You've been watching Tiski Sour on Novara Media. Good night.